What I'd like to say about Professor Milanovic, that he doesn't need any introduction. Still, I need to say something about him. And also, my capacity is not enough to describe him from his works. To me, he's like one big elephant, and maybe I am roaming around the ground, around one of the four pillars. So it's very difficult for me to describe him. Primarily, I know him for his work on measurement of economic inequality, and particularly on simplification of measurement techniques with alternative derivations. His first contribution in this direction, titled Generalized Gini Coefficient, an Alternative Approach, appeared in Economic Analysis and Workers' Management in 1990. And subsequently, his contributions like Gini-type functions and alternative derivation, which appeared in Bulletin of Economic Research in 1994, and a simple way to calculate Gini coefficient, and some implications, which appeared in the Economics Letters in 1997, have been the sources for inspiration for many young researchers on theoretical issues across countries in the world. However, theoretical researchers are not too many. If I count citations of these two said papers, for the first we see it is near about 50, and for the second it was nearly 250. However, as of now, nearly he has 22,500 citations. So if I mention his theoretical works, then I could just explain slightly more than 2% of his works. So obviously it means that he is much popular for his works in the other dimension. At the same time, I can say that he is also well known to the world for his theoretical contributions. Now, in addition to this, through his empirical works, he opened new avenues of scientific research on the subject of globalization, poverty, and economic inequality. Many of his books are famous. For example, Worlds Apart, The Haves and Have-Nots, and then Global Inequality, a New Approach for the Age of Globalization. I would also like to mention about his work, Global Inequality Recalculated and Updated, which appeared in the Journal of Economic Inequality in 2012. All these works rejuvenated our understanding of the related issues and have shown us new directions. And many of his works are part of our academic curriculum in our department. Now, his book, Capitalism Alone, The Future of the System That Rules the World, was published in September 2019. I'm thankful to him that department has already good relationship with Professor Milanovic, that in July he committed to send me the book, and he did it. And finally, let me conclude by stating that Professor Milanovic is a visiting presidential professor at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York, an affiliate senior scholar at the Luxembourg Income Study. He also teaches at the London School of Economics and the Barcelona Institute of International Studies. And in 2019, he has been appointed the Honorary Medicine Chair at the University of Groningen. Milanovic formerly was a lead economist in the World Bank Research Department, visiting professor at the University of Maryland and Johns Hopkins University. So, thank you, sir, for accepting our invitation. And now I request the chair to take over the session.
Good evening to all. Today, Professor Branko Milanovic is with us to deliver the lecture on Capitalism Alone, the future of the system that rules the world. Now, this is the first special lecture of the special lecture and webinar series, which is being organized by the Department of Economics, North Bengal University, and we are really fortunate and privileged to have you here, sir. And let me just introduce myself. I thought Amlan is going to do that. And anyway, I'm Sanchari Roy Mukherjee. I'm a professor of this Department of Economics, North Bengal University. However, I'm on leave right now since I have assumed an administrative position as Vice Chancellor of one university in West Bengal, Dakshin Dinajpur University, and also with as additional charge of another university, Raiganj University. So that is how I'm here today. And of course, I also welcome the other senior professors from all over the world. And without much ado, I would hand over to Professor Branko Milanovic for his lecture.
Well, first, thank you very much. I would like to thank everybody, and of course, Amlan in particular, for the invitation. It is a pleasure to be there, not of course totally physically, but at least virtually. We are all together. And I'm also grateful to Amlan to have, given a very good introduction, because it is true that my early work was based on income distribution, because my dissertation was even on income distribution in Yugoslavia many years ago, 1987. But then, of course, there was some theoretical or methodological work. And then, I continued with work on global inequality. And the most recent book that Amlan showed, and actually that I'm going to present today, is called, as you can see, Capitalism Alone. It is a title that is not, of course, randomly chosen. Even the comma between capitalism and alone is intentional. And the title essentially says the following, that the world today, for the first time probably in history, has essentially only one economic system, and that economic system is capitalism. Now, it is so often people don't think very much about that, but with the end of communism, with the fall of communism in the former Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, these countries obviously they privatized, and they regulated, and so on, and they became capitalist. But the question is often asked, but is it true for China? As you can see here, actually, I think that you can see this slide. I'm not quite sure if we will be able to move the slides, but at least I think you can see, the slide with the structure of the book. That question is being addressed in chapter 3, where I show that China, if you use a standard definition of capitalism, I will tell you that in a minute, is essentially economically a capitalist country. It does differ, of course, from what I call liberal or meritocratic capitalism that you can see here in chapter 2, in the political sense, because liberal meritocratic capitalism is a capitalism with the political superstructure, if you will, composed of a democratic system. But political capitalism is not. It is, as we know, in case of China or Vietnam or Algeria or Burma or a few other countries, it is composed of essentially either de facto or even de jure single party system. But the underlying, the economic sphere is capitalist. So let me then say what is my definition of capitalism, so that at least we are quite sure what I mean when I say that word. The definition that I use is taken from It is actually Marx's original definition. It's also used by Max Weber. And that definition is very simple, very succinct, very economical in some sense, because it focuses on three criteria. The first one is that most of the production should be conducted on privately owned capital. And if you look at, for example, China, 80% of value added in China is in the private sector. Now, that private sector is not always private sector using hired labor, because there are lots of production is done in the agricultural area where you basically have self-employed farmers, but it's still private. Obviously, the land is private. And then the second requirement is that the most of the labor should be hired. So workers or labor must not have or exercise the entrepreneurial function. So that's the second part of the definition of capitalism. And the third part is that the coordination is decentralized. So if you look at these criteria, as I said, actually, then China does actually fulfill them and could be treated, as I argue, actually, as a capitalist country. In that chapter, it's easy to actually define China as I did it now, but I think that chapter, if you decide to read it, is a little bit deeper than that, and I will not present it today, but I wanted to say that in that chapter I asked the following question: what was the global historical role of communism? And then from this sort of a genesis type of what communism first, what are the countries that actually sort of communism was important in order to break the colonial inheritance, or actually to make the countries independent, and also to break the feudal institutions. I derived really China's current conditions from a historical examination of what happened. So it was not simply the definition of political capitalism without looking at the genesis or genealogy of the development. So much for these two capitalisms, which I think nowadays are while both being capitalists, they are the two dominant types in the political arena, and they, of course, as I said before, differ by the level of democratic involvement in decision making. But I would speak today mostly about liberal or meritocratic capitalism. So let me then start with, if I can actually manage to share the screen, which I'm not quite sure that I know how to do. Can you see now the other slides, or are you still on the same slide?
So we can see.
No, we can see it.
Okay, excellent. So it is moving. So let me then when I start talking about liberal meritocratic capitalism, you can. Yes. So that's good. So let me start sort of historically and just give you an idea what, for example, classical capitalism was, and then you will see what is the difference between that classical capitalism and I think what is today's capitalism. Now, in the classical capitalism of the Ricardo Marx type, you essentially, to simplify, you have two classes. Of course, in Ricardo, there are landlords as well, but I just want to focus on capitalists and workers. And if I draw on a horizontal axis their income and number of people on the vertical axis, as you can see here, the important part is to realize first that your income position in the personal income distribution, your position is really determined by your class. So there is no overlap here. All the workers are poorer than all the capitalists, and capitalists receive only income from ownership, from property, and workers receive income only from labor. This is a very sort of a stark, simplified picture of reality, but clearly in the 19th century England, that was, of course, the prototype that both Ricardo and Marx had in mind. I think that picture broadly made sense. Of course, there are also people who were self-employed and others and complicated the picture, but I think this picture made broadly sense. And a different way to sort of express it is that you rank people by total income from left to right. And as you can see, actually labor income is not, everybody doesn't have the same wage. Wages do differ, and labor income increases from left to right. Actually, there are people with high labor income. But at the very top of the income distribution, with this kind of exponential curve, is capital income. So in other words, capitalists are at the top of the income distribution. The distribution of that capital income is very unequal, and there is no overlap between laborers and capitalists. These are the three important points that in a minute you would see how they differ today. So this is a very also a sort of a simplified sketch, obviously, of a situation that we face today. Labor income, I drew it just for simplicity the same way that I drew it like in a classical capitalism. But I notice now how capital income behaves, and that's really quite important. Capital income for, I'm talking about rich countries, capital income for about 30 to 35% of the population is zero. In other words, about 1/3 of the population in rich countries have no positive wealth. So their wealth is either zero, or actually in some countries, in some cases, it is negative because they have borrowed more than their actual net wealth is negative because they have borrowed more than their gross wealth. So that's actually why the blue line, which is capital income, is as following the abscissa, it's basically zero. And then you start actually people having some capital income. The amounts are relatively small at first, but they increase. And then at the very top of the income distribution, you notice that the blue line overtakes the red line, meaning that at the very top of the income distribution, people have more income from capital than labor. So things have changed in the sense that we now have people who have both capital and labor income, and I will talk to you about that in a minute. But at the very top of the income distribution, we still have capitalists. We have still people who are predominantly receiving income from property. So as you can see, there are things which have changed and things which have not changed. But an alternative that we can sort of imagine, and I think it's important to imagine it sort of to realize from that imagined capitalism how far we are now. Imagine what I call the people's capitalism or homopolitic. I'll explain the term in a minute. It would be a capitalism where inequality in the types of income, labor versus capital, does not exist. In other words, your income may be higher than my income, or my income can be higher than yours, but the composition of our incomes would be the same. So we would both have, let's suppose, 60% or 70% of income from labor and 30 or 40% income from capital. So that sort of ideal typical capitalism, like what they call people's capitalism, it would be very interesting in the following sense. It does have inequality. It can even have high inequality, but it does not have inequality in the type of incomes that people receive. So in other words, we are all equally laborers or capitalists, but some of us have more of both labor income and capital income, and others have less of it. So, you know, the point of this sort of ideal typical case is to focus on the difference between inequality in income, which we normally sort of work with, and inequality in the composition of that income between labor and capital. So after I have introduced all of this, let me just go and sort of discuss. I will not spend too much time, but I'll discuss what I call the systemic inequalities in liberal or meritocratic capitalism. And you would see how what I have sort of so far expressed in a rather, how should I say, rather summary fashion would now be shown in more empirical using actual data. So the first systemic inequality, and I will not read all of that because I think you can read it yourselves, and we will go over that anyway, is the increasing aggregate share of capital in national income. So this is something which has been known for a while, that in most countries, the share of capital has risen in the last 30 or 40 years. This is from the work, as you can see, Matthew Rongley. It shows the G7 countries, but practically you can actually take any country where you have the data on capital and labor shares, and you would actually see the increase in the capital share. Now, why is this increase in the capital share? The increase might come actually from greater use of robotics, of mechanization, basically increase in the capital labor ratio, so higher capital intensity of production, without concomitant decline in the rate of return to capital. Because in a simple production function, if capital goes up by 10% and the rate of return or profit on capital does not decline equivalently by 10%, then obviously the share of capital in total output has arithmetically to go up. So this is what we have observed. And as I said, explanations might have with technological change, might have to do with greater capital intensity of production, might have also to do with the greater power of capital versus labor, weaker trade unions. So I leave that aside, but I just note the increase in the capital share. Now, why is that increase in the capital share problematic? In principle, there is no reason why, one type of income, be it capital or labor, should increase inequality per se. But capital does that precisely because capital income is heavily concentrated among the rich. You have seen this original slide where I showed actually that capital income increases as you move along the income distribution, and that it is particularly strong among the rich. So when you have an increasing importance of a source of income, which is heavily concentrated among the rich, what does it happen? What happens is that you have a quasi-automatic spill over into the higher personal income inequality. So we there see this important link, which actually I think for a long time has been kind of ignored, the link between the functional income distribution and interpersonal income distribution. The reason why that link for a long time has been ignored is because of the assumption, which was not always a warranted assumption, but the assumption was made that functional income distribution is somehow fixed. And if you have a functional income distribution with capital and labor shares given, then obviously you don't need very much to worry about them spilling into interpersonal income distribution, because basically the functional distribution doesn't change. But in this case, in the recent past, it has changed in favor of capital. And to show you, as I said, how much more unequally capital is distributed than labor, here are slides for several countries. You see that the blue line is the Gini coefficient of capital income. So it's really income that people receive, and the Gini coefficient of that type of income, these are interest, dividends, rents, and so on, that people receive. And the red line is the labor income, so Gini coefficient of labor income. So not surprisingly, of course, capital income Gini is always much higher. You notice that actually in all these countries that I have here, and I could have shown you many more countries because this is based on Luxembourg income study data, and there are 25, at least 25 countries which have very detailed data on capital and labor, or actually maybe more, because we currently have now almost 50 countries in Luxembourg income study. And they all show the same results. So essentially, Gini of capital income is 0.9, very, very high, as you can notice that even above 0.9. And Gini of labor income, which has increased significantly both in the US and the UK, is about 0.55, even 0.60 in the UK now. But the gap between the two remains. So then the question, as I said before, let's suppose capital income is increasing in importance, the share of capital income goes up, what will happen to interpersonal inequality? It's obvious from this slide that it would have to increase because the more unequal source of income is becoming more important. And that's actually which drives an increase in inequality. So this is the first step. This is the first sort of a systemic, or actually the second systemic force for rising inequality. Then there is another one, which is that the return of assets of the people, it differs depending on what type of assets you hold. We know this is a complicated graph, so I'm not even going to try to explain. It comes from Ed Wolf, but basically what the graph shows is that most of the assets held by the rich are financial instruments, whereas the middle class in rich countries basically has only, or most of their assets are in housing. So depending on which of the two types of assets is increasing more in value, you will have actually the rich getting ahead of the middle class, or the middle class getting ahead of the rich. The point simply is there to realize that the asset composition varies across income distribution, that the further you go in income distribution, more important in relative terms, and not only in absolute terms, are assets, financial assets. For the very top people, the housing might represent only 5, less than or 10% of their total assets. Most of them are financial. But for the middle class in the United States, of course, most of the assets that they have are in housing. And so you can see here this very heavy concentration of financial assets among the top. As you notice that this is from Ed Wolf. There are similar other studies that show that essentially the top 10% of people who have 90 or over 90% of financial assets, depending how you define it. As you can see here, stocks and mutual funds, if you include them all, then you have 93% of all stocks and mutual funds owned by 10% of people. So we are really talking about a very high concentration of financial wealth. You can actually say that the United States is practically owned by 10% of people. And also the issue there is that the rate of return is not independent of the level of assets that you have. So this is a nice work by Eric Zweig, which shows that if you have more of a given type of asset, then the rate of return, so I point again, the rate of return is higher. Now, this is an important result because it shows that if you show up at the bank and you come with, let's suppose, $500, you would, get a rate of return nowadays of less than 1%. But if you show up with, $500,000, then it would be the different story because they would give you assets which, even adjusted for risk, would bear more. It's simply that there are flat entry fees for many of these asset classes, and the more you have them, the easier for you is to, go into that particular asset type and make high return. So this is, I think, a somewhat of an issue that has not been really paid much attention to, and it's an important issue because it shows that the very returns on assets vary in function of the amount of the assets that you have, and consequently that the rich people would then have higher rate of return than the poor. In other words, you can imagine R for the rich people being consistently higher than the rate of return for the middle class and the poor. Now, let me go to the third type, which I kind of defined in this book, which I called homoplutia. That's obviously like whenever we need a new term, we go back to Greek and put together two words. Homo means obviously the same. Plutia means wealth. And here the idea is to show that at the very top of the income distribution, the same people tend nowadays to be both capital rich in terms of having a high capital income and labor rich. Remember, from the very beginning, we said that in the classical capitalism, that was really very unlikely because the very rich people would essentially have only capital income. Here, in real world now, the rich have both capital and labor income. So what does this slide show? It shows you that excuse me, it shows you that the percentage of people in the top decile in the United States who are both in the top decile of capitalists and top decile of workers. In other words, you take people who are in the overall income by the United States in the top decile. So you take everybody in that group and say how many of them are also in the top decile as capitalists and in the top decile by workers. This is kind of unusual, in a more classical capitalist case. The people who are actually in top decile of capitalists are unlikely to be in the top decile of workers because they would not have high labor incomes. But nowadays they do. And as you notice here, the share of such people has risen from about 15% to almost 30%. So it's really doubling between 1980 and today. And if you put different countries from Luxembourg income study, what you notice in this slide is that these percentages are pretty high, about 20 or 25%, but in countries that you can still call classical capitalist countries like Mexico and Brazil, the percentages are relatively low. And the reason why they are low is precisely because these countries are closer to classical capitalism. You would have in those countries people at the top of income distribution. They would tend to be predominantly capitalists, so they would not have very much of labor income. That's why only 8% of people would be there in both, with the top capitalist class and top laborers. Now, the question is actually first, how much of U.S. inequality is driven by homoplotia, and does homoplotia makes an important issue? And I will just mention it now. But maybe can leave it for discussion. Does homoplotia make social mobility less and fight against inequality more difficult? Or is it a dramatic improvement upon classical capitalism? Let me give you the reasons for both of these positions. Start with the second one. Is it an improvement upon classical capitalism? You could say yes, because you could say, unlike in classical capitalism, where you had really this very strong and marked difference between capitalists and workers, as we were saying before, they would actually, if they're capitalists, they're never going to be, workers. Here we don't have it. So actually the cleavage, the class cleavage is much less, and that itself is a good thing. But why would it make social mobility less? Here, the reason is the following. If you have families that are actually rich both in terms of capital and labor income, first, it makes them fairly invulnerable to the changes in either of these two. If the stock market goes down, they are actually people with high so-called human capital, so they're actually still making quite a lot of money from labor. If something happens on the labor side, let's say unemployment and that these particular jobs disappear, that are high-paying jobs, but maybe they disappear, they, of course, have quite a lot of financial wealth to fall back upon. And not only that, by being presumably highly educated because they have high labor incomes and having, in some cases, inherited wealth, they are also able to transmit these advantages to children who themselves then become homoplotic in the sense of having both high labor incomes and high capital incomes. So homoplotia then has this ambivalent role. At some level, as I said before, it may be considered an improvement upon classical capitalism. At the other level, it can be seen as really the creation of something which looks like almost a sort of a class on its own, where the transmission of wealth and all the other advantages coming from education, going to schools which actually allow you the access to the best paying job, is being transmitted across generations, as I said. So it does create an elite. And this is, of course, the danger of homoplotia. Here I will skip some of the slides because, we don't have that much time. Here what I did the work with Jonathan Berman. You see now that on different databases we find increasing homoplotia in the US. I showed you one database. Here we had 3 of them, and the results are more or less the same. And we argue that that homoplutia explains 1/5 of the increase in U.S. inequality between 1985 and 2020. So, in other words, the fact that you had actually increase in homoplutia in that coincidence between high labor and capital incomes is as important or as important as the increase in the capital share. In other words, the increase in the capital share, of which I spoke before, and increase in homoplutia could be seen as two different causes of the overall increase in inequality. Obviously, increase in labor inequalities is yet another cause which pushes overall interpersonal income inequality to go up. So another, like number 4, structural or systemic inequality is something that has been studied quite a lot. It is a homogamy or assortative mating. And this has been really in many countries found, is that you have an increasing percentage of partners or couples who are actually of the similar income and educational level. You notice that here, I'm looking here at the cohort of American males who were aged between 20 and 35. And in the 1970s, these percentages give you likelihood of them marrying the equivalently rich women. That was actually the orange line, or the women who are at the bottom income group by their earnings. Notice here is the population is only men and women who are both having a positive labor earning. So we are really talking about people who are in the working age population, who are actually working. And in 1970, the likelihood of marrying or being partners, whether with rich or poor, was about the same. Well, nowadays, as you can see, in 2017, the ratio is 3-1 in favor of marrying richer rather than poor. And the same thing is even more dramatically from the point of view of women. The ratio is 5-1. So the point here is that, again, the complexity of income distribution in general is that this phenomenon comes essentially from the greater freedom to choose your partners and for much greater participation of women in education and labor force. So these are actually both good developments. However, if people tend to choose as partners somebody who is equally rich like them, or if they are poor, somebody who is equally poor like them, that arithmetically increases inequality. So I want really to highlight this ambiguity that oftentimes you find when you work on inequality, that something which is in principle a good development in a social sense, as I said for this one, especially the freedom to choose your partners, might turn out in when you look at it from the point of view of inequality, might turn out to actually contribute to inequality. And you have noticed this ambivalence, I pointed this out, in the case of homoplutia as well. So now let me try to wrap with a sort of a political implications of all of that. Is that this is from the work of political scientists, is essentially that this is complicated graph, so I will not even try to explain it very much, but essentially what it says with this upward sloping line, which applies to the rich people, it says that if there are some issues that matter to the rich, they tend to be discussed and to be acted upon politically much more likely than if some other issues matter to the middle class or to the poor. In other words, if you're a rich person and to you what it matters is, taxation policies or zoning or something else, that is much more likely to be represented in the public sphere or to be actually acted upon and voted and to have a political resonance than if you're a poor person and for you what might matter is really having better sanitation or better conditions in the poor part of the city where you live, and that would not really have much of a political salience. So why does it all matter? Because essentially when we come to the political part, we are essentially coming to we are basically wrapping up the advantages that come with very high inequality, because the wrapping up of these advantages has to take two forms. One is the political ability to influence the political process and to make sure that the rules, regulations, laws, which are in your favor, are implemented. So that's the political role of the wealth, and actually, it becomes plutocracy rather than democracy. And the second one is the use of education to reproduce inequality across generations. So in such a way, inequality, which as I started in the very beginning, which comes from the rising capital share and from the increasing mixing of people who are both labor income rich and capital income rich, is then conveyed or transmitted across generations, both through the control of the political process and through ability to leave to the next generation higher incomes, higher wealth rather, through inheritance, and to actually make sure that they attend expensive colleges, universities, which then practically automatically after they graduate, give them access to high-paying jobs. So I think we have to draw here in this kind of a work, we have to draw political and social implications of the rising inequality. I think one of the issues with the work, and I'll stop here then my presentation, I think one of the issues with the work on inequality in the 70s and the 80s, and of course in the 90s, I remember it, was that we were very shy in drawing political and social implications, including like the formation of an elite and linking the lack of social mobility to the underlying inequality of income. And I think this is something that we are doing much more now than we did in the past. If you actually look at these things and if you believe in them, I think that the solution to the problem is relatively straightforward. The solution is higher taxation of wealth, and particularly higher taxation of inheritance. The second one is much greater prominence given to public education, so that actually that it could be open to all in reality, not simply that it's open to all theoretically, but it should be better education than private and be open to everybody. And then addressing really heads on the private funding of political campaigns, because the campaign contributions, which is actually an interesting detail, are the most concentrated form of expenditure which exists in the US and maybe in the world. It is the 1/100th of the top 1%. So in other words, top 1% of the top 1% is responsible for almost half of the political contributions in 2016 elections. So as you can see, there is no practically type of expenditure, maybe actually the expenditure on private planes or something, but there is really almost no type of expenditure that is as concentrated as political contributions. And if they're so concentrated, of course, one wonders like, what do they get out of it? Because certainly people are not giving political contributions without expecting anything in return. So this is, I think, all for now. But as I said, I really wanted to emphasize that when we work with inequality, and as I did this in Capitalism alone, we really have to go beyond only numbers. We have to go into the longer term processes and into the political importance of these numbers. So let me stop sharing, and then maybe we can continue the discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Milanovic. It was indeed a very, very vivid presentation. Although we would love to listen to the whole book, actually, but you concentrated on homoplotia. But it was definitely very interesting for all of us, and a revelation too, because even though we study macroeconomics and we study inequality and all, but this is quite an innovative way of dealing with inequality. Before going into the discussion part, I would like to invite questions from the audience, from the listeners, and the floor is open to you. If you have any questions, you can directly unmute yourself and raise your question. And Professor Milanovic can take the questions together also, or you can answer them individually also. Since it is already 8:15, I think we have crossed 8:15. We still have 15 to 16 minutes left. And therefore, we can take at least 3 to 4 questions if they are not very long. And please try to be specific as to what answer you would like to get from your questions. Okay, please, can you directly ask? I would also like to request Professor Enrica Shapiro and Professor, I'm forgetting the name, from Japan, and Professor Subramaniam, if they can take on the podium first, so that the others can get inspired and have some questions for you. Or Amlan or Govindu, anybody from the department? Unmute yourself, Amlan.
Sorry, I do not have any question. Just I would like to highlight the point, the suggestions were given in the page number 217. The third point, citizenship light, which would entail the end of strictly binary division between citizens and non-citizens. The objective is to allow migration without provoking nationalist backlash. So I'm just thinking, how is it possible, say, from Asia to America or America to Europe? Maybe it may not be that much tough. Even from Japan to, say, US, it may not be. For a country like India, what I think that how is it possible and how long will it take to materialize this kind of solutions?
Can I just very briefly, this is something that I did not cover in the presentation. It's really somewhat a different topic. But since you raised it, I would be very, very brief because I don't want to take too much time and I see there are other questions. This is a proposal, this is in chapter 4, this is a proposal about it's sort of a new migration policy that tries to be a compromise between fully open borders, which are unrealistic politically, and between, Fortress Europe kind of a world where actually there will be no migration at all, and also the Fortress United States. Because I think there are, of course, forces that actually are trying to create such fortresses. And in order to acknowledge their political importance, I think what I was arguing is that some migration should be very specific migration where people go for the jobs, only for specific jobs when they have, and then they have to return to their own country. It is something which exists in Singapore, it exists in Gulf countries to some extent even in the UK and Canada with a point system. But I just wanted to only briefly mention that it's a kind of a compromise solution that both sides don't like in some sense, because the free migration side would like actually to see entirely free migration, but politically this is not, I think, feasible. And then if we do not go with some compromise, I'm afraid we would actually open ourselves to really people who would like to close down the migration. So anyway, so that's all for that, because as I said, I didn't want to, it was not something that, it's complicated, I didn't want to go into that now.
Professor Pinaki Chakraborty from National Institute of Public Finance and Policy, India.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Hand. So, Pinaki, welcome. And you can also, please.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Go ahead.
Thank you, Professor Milanovic, for such a fascinating lecture. I just had two comments and question. So first comment is, I definitely feel that there is an urgent need for have more progressive taxation and more taxation of wealth and inheritance. But at the same time, if we look at the political economy of taxation over the last 30 years, we have been seeing one size fits all kind of a homogeneity in taxation across the world. So how do you see this space emerging post-COVID? That's that's out of curiosity. And I thought that I take this opportunity to ask this question to you. And the second issue that I wanted to ask is the issue of increasing inequality in an unprecedented times, like COVID, and inequality in a normal time. Would you like to differentiate between the two if one has to do that? And the third question that I wanted to ask, in fact, inheritance tax is a very complex issue, and the kind of data that I had analyzed in the past do show that it does not give major revenue. Probably it gives a signal, and which always works as a dampener for creation of wealth and growth. So that's the kind of argument. So I thought I take this opportunity to ask you these three questions. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much. I appreciate really Professor Chakrabarty's question. I do agree, for example, that last point, that really the revenue impacts of taxation of inheritance are relatively small, and actually there is lots of dislike among people to have inheritance taxed. We could of course have a wealth tax, so that actually if one prefers that, actually then you can have wealth taxation every year rather than having a taxation of inheritance at somebody's passing. But the objective here, and I agree that there are issues there, but the objective is essentially following what John Rawls was saying, and he actually had these two sort of also in mind. The objective is to reduce the advantages that come from birth and which are undeserved from the point of view of the person who receives them. So this is and he had in mind two things, which I also have here. One is reduction of inequality in financial wealth that rich families compared to the poor families or middle-class families are able to transfer to their sons and daughters. And the second one is public education, for the reasons that I mentioned, so I don't need to say it again. But as you notice, you really work on both factors of production in some way. You reduce the transmission of capital, income, or wealth, and you reduce the ability to use money to buy and to create human capital. So this is essentially the ideology behind the proposals. But I agree with you that actually, as you said, the inheritance tax is not a very plentiful source of revenue. We would obviously have to continue with income taxation, the usual direct income taxation, and so on. But it does actually send an important message in terms of social mobility. And when it comes to COVID, of course, the book was written before COVID. It was published before COVID. I would not change, I think, anything with the exception of one point, which has to deal with my relatively skeptical view towards universal benefit, UBI. And I think that had the rich countries had UBI before COVID, you would not have to go through this, through the political process in order to disperse all that money, which lots of money, as you know, was dispersed, maybe 15 or 20% of GDP to help people who lost their jobs. UBI would do that automatically. So I thought actually in conditions of really exceptional gravity like COVID, UBI would have been helpful to have. So that's one issue where I have changed. And finally, on taxation policy homogeneity, yes, I think actually that's a result of globalization. But then it can work the other way too, because if you start having maybe taxation of inheritance, there could be maybe a push towards homogenization of that too. So if 1 or 2, 5 countries have it, maybe the others would have it too. So it says that. But I do take your points, especially on the amount of revenues that you can collect from taxation of inheritance.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sanchari.
We also have Professor Martinetti Chairperson. She has also raised her hand. Well,
Thank
Enrica, you can have your question now.
Yes, so thank you very much, Professor Milanovic, for this fascinating presentation. I really enjoyed it a lot. Just a couple of comments or questions. As an Italian person, I was surprised from a certain point of view, from one hand, but probably not so much from the other hand, regarding the slides that you presented related to the percentage of labor-rich households who are also capital rich. And Italy is really in the top of this ranking, together with other European countries like the Netherlands or Finland. So I'm not fully surprised, because it is quite evident that, at least particularly as far as for my country, Italy, we have, as you may know, a quite old population. So they have a lot of savings. We have a tendency to we have a very high percentage of households that own their house. So it is not surprising that there might be some sort of concentration. I'm just wondering if this data, this graph, can change if instead of just considering capital overall, you split capital in financial capital and in the housing ownership. So this was my first question. A comment to this is that those countries have, regarding the policy implication that you were mentioning, Italy, as well as the Netherlands or Finland, have a quite high level of taxation, particularly for dependent work, and we have a public school at a higher, till the higher level of education. So, in these cases, your policy suggestions to have a public school at a higher level and higher taxation can somehow not fit very well with this specific case, this specific country. So I'm just wondering, and of course there is a matter of political consensus to implement such kind of policies, particularly in terms of taxation for countries that have already a quite high taxation system. So I would like to know your point of view on that. And if I may, I can profit and just have another little question. I'm particularly interested in this time to the issue of economic democracy. So in a higher level of participation to people, workers, citizens, into the to the place where economic decisions are taken. And I was wondering if you think that in this regard it can help the and it's still not much common to have workers and workers representative in the firms that can co-manage or participate in the decision in the firms. Is it a possible way for reconsidering the share of labor income and capital income? Thank you.
Well, excellent questions. Thank you very much. Excuse me. I would again try to answer all of them, but briefly. Let me start with the last. I'll go in the opposite order, like with the economic democracy. I'm actually arguing, of course, I didn't mention it, but I'm arguing also for worker ownership. But I'm not in favor of worker management role without ownership. This is a long discussion, but I think that there are issues there. But I think that workers should be able, to have a greater importance in the companies they work through their shareholding, because we have a really paradoxical situation that is really CEOs who get shares, and not workers. CEOs, as you know, very often the top management layer is very often incentivized through shares, but not workers. And the advantage of having workers is, as you said, is that you would actually spread the income from capital much more widely, and consequently the increase in the capital share, which in the future can be also quite important, especially if you have in mind robotization and automatization of work, then you would actually not have that automatic transmission into higher inequality that I talked about in the beginning. So in other words, if we all become shareholders theoretically, then increase in the capital share would not make inequality greater. I know that's kind of an extreme case. We are not all going to become shareholders. Many people are not interested. Many people really don't want it because it's risky and so on. But if we have more of shareholders, we would certainly reduce that spillover effect from the rising capital share into interpersonal equality. So I'm very much in favor of that. Your second point about Europe and public education is a good one. And I receive that point very often, for example, also France, which has, of course, public education, but it is also very elitist public education, despite of being public. My book was really dealing mostly with the US case, where private education is extremely expensive. As you know, it's basically unaffordable for a middle-class family to have both, kids go, because it's not only people only talk very often about university, but in order to come to university at that level, you need to invest. Actually, there was a book by Daniel Markovic who actually shows that the total investment is actually between $5 and $10 million over time to get there. So these are really enormous investments that basically the cost is like an entry cost, which really maintains the monopoly. So I take your point that this is not something which is common to all capitalist countries. And then, of course, homoplutia, the point about Italy. I have a co-author, and we have done some work, and he has done his own work. Italy is very interesting and very specific because actually also has lots of people who are self-employed with small companies. So they have capital and labor income. And it is an aging population, so capital income comes in the form of savings, which are then received at an older age. So it has really, not only Italy, actually, you have the similar situation in Nordic countries where people have invested pensions and then they become, it's very interesting, they become capitalists towards the end of their lives. When they are pensioners, they become capitalists because they have invested savings, and these savings come from the pension funds. So there are many interesting issues there, including one that you mentioned, distinction between housing and financial capital. Just in terms of definition, what I'm using in that graph is really financial capital, because what I'm using as capital incomes are dividends, rents, and interest, and they are underestimated because we know that they are underestimated at the top of the income distribution. So I think actually that the importance of homoplutia would probably be even greater with different, with better data. So that's how it is definitionally now.
Many thanks.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Professor Milanovic. If there are any other questions, we can take just one more. Any other question? Professor Subramaniam, Professor Usago? Well, I think we've come to the end of this session. In fact, a very, very interesting session, and as Pinaki pointed out, a very fascinating session. And as from the chair, I would just like to, since I cannot ask questions, I'll just give the salient points and close this session, just for the benefit of the listeners who have come in late. Well, Professor Milanovic, he started his lecture today by giving a very brief global historic origination of communism. and later how these countries like Russia and China, they shifted to capitalism. And then he differentiated between income from labor income and capital income. Please correct me if I'm wrong, because I've just been listening to you for the first time. Anyway, labor income and capital income. And well, he identifies that there are six systemic inequality in liberal capitalism, and where, first of all, the increase in share of capital in most of the countries in the world. And this is particularly because of the technology and the robotics, and where we find that the capital is heavily concentrated in such countries. And then he comes to the homoplotia, which is the main part of his presentation today, where actually he talks about US, and we find that rich people on the top decile of capital earnings, and also are found to be in the top decile of the workers. And here, first, he talks about the rich people they are investing in financial assets, and therefore, which gives higher return, like stocks and mutual funds. And therefore, in short, the rich are getting richer, and they can invest in more of capital and less of worker in the labor. But at the same time, because of the labor income and the capital income, it balances out if there is any kind of calamities in either in the labor situation or in the capital situation. And then he talks about whether it has been an improvement from classical capitalists, and he says yes, there has been an improvement from classical capitalists to what the liberal capitalism is right now. And then he also tells us about homogamy, where we find that the rich males actually are in the most likelihood of marrying or having partners who are rich women, and also he also talked about positive labor earnings in case of such rich people, rich women. And finally he talked about the policy responsiveness to the divergent preferences of the rich and the middle and the poor class, where he says that the rich having power over the political dispensation, which will be in their favor, and also the middle class looking out for some opportunities, and the poor concentrating on basically the amenities which can make them which can improve their well-being. And therefore, so basically in the case of policy responsiveness, he talks about that education can be one of the ways where to increase the economic advantages of the people. But however, education, because of the inheritance laws, and what he talks about is that the rich people or the rich children actually inherit the the wealth of the richer parents, and therefore they can invest in the best of education or public education, and as he talks about, and therefore they have a much more, much brighter future in the capitalistic world, and which is carried on, and the middle class remains as a middle class. And then we received some questions from Professor Pinaki Chakraborty, from Dr. Amlan Majumder, and Professor Enrica Chaparro, and which have been very interesting also, where we concentrated on, of course, progressive taxation, how it can benefit to reduce the inequality. Actually, I forgot to say, the very essence of this lecture is how capitalism actually has accentuated or perpetuated inequality in the system, and the ways out which we can devise, how we can improve on this. And Professor Pinaki Chakraborty has proposed progressive taxation, and of course, and also Professor Enrica Chaparro, she talks about economic democracy, which is a very interesting point actually, and which Professor Milanovic says that workers should be able to have some kind of shareholding in the company so that they can improve their capital holding in the future. So, with these few words, I would like to close the session. Thank you once again, Professor Branko Milanovic. We would like to have you again with the rest of your books and your other works in the future. And thanks to the department, thanks to our head of the department, Dr. Amlan Majumdar, for arranging this, and also Dr. Gobindu Chaudhary assisting him, and the rest of the department, my own faculty members, and I wish there were more participants today, but of course we have very erudite scholars in the listeners group, and thank you once again, Professor Milanovic, and if Dr. Amlan Majumdar wants to say something, a closing word from you. With this, I'll sign off too. Thank you once again.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation, and thank you for the questions and the discussion. It was a pleasure. And
Amlan, would you like to give the vote of thanks, or would you like to close?
Thanks, everyone. First of all, I thank you, Sir Professor Milanovic, for accepting this invitation and giving us an opportunity to enlighten us on the topic. We are very much interested. We have revised our PG syllabus, and we have incorporated some of the issues in our syllabus, so that even we have distributed your books to read. And in this way, we are incorporating, and we will be very fortunate if you consider a physical visit to our university. This is my request, and maybe it's my dream that one day you will come and physically address our students. And I'm thankful to other distinguished scholars, Professor Enrica ma'am, I'm thankful to you. I know that you have returned last night from Nairobi, Kenya, and you have managed to join this event. And I am thankful to Kushago Sensei. I know that it's almost midnight in Japan, but you have given time to attend this event. And we all are also waiting for your physical visit. You know that very recently you will come to our department. And I am also thankful to Pinakida, being a very busy person, and he has been involved in preparing Indian budget for several years. So Pinakida is our alumni. He is our student. He's just 1 or 2 years senior than me. And I'm thankful to you, Pinakida. You spent your valuable time. And I'm thankful to Professor, our Tapas Chatterjee, sir, who is a senior administrator of our university. I have seen him that he has also spent his enough time. And I'm also thankful to our senior professor, Professor Konok Kanti Bakchi, Professor Onil Bhuimali, Sudokshina Roy, Kanchan Dotto, Govinda Chaudhuri, and others. Karan Tamang, Karan is here. Please come, Karan, here. You have been out of the screen. Just come here. Karan was helping me, and other research scholars also helped us. The CIRM, that is the Center for Resource and Information Management of the University of North Bengal, they have helped us to prepare all the background works on this Google Meet and the YouTube streaming. I am thankful to all. And finally, I am thankful to our university authority, our Vice Chancellor, sir, who is constantly encouraging us to organize this kind of event and invite distinguished scholars from different parts of the world. We are thankful. Although we had limitations because of the financial austerity which is going on during this COVID period, we are unable to buy essential gadgets. However, in that time also, we are hopeful that in some way or other, if we can connect each other and exchange our views and ideas so that we can have a better future, common future for all. Thanks, everyone. I am thankful to everyone. Please, we will meet
Thank
again.
you. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. So our scholars may leave now. I do not know whether we have guests from outside. Our scholars may leave, and we may have discussion with our teachers.